Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Few men in modern history have embodied this truth more completely than Saddam Hussein, the dictator who ruled Iraq with an iron fist for nearly a quarter of a century. His reign was marked by systematic brutality, mass murder, and a cruelty so profound that it reshaped an entire nation into a landscape of fear. This is the story of the most brutal things done by one of history's most ruthless tyrants, a chronicle of how ambition without conscience can transform a country into a living nightmare. Born in 1937 in the village of Alja near Tikrit, Saddam Hussein Abdal Majid al-Tikriti entered a world of poverty and hardship. His father died before his birth, and his stepfather was brutal and dismissive. This early life of deprivation and abuse shaped the paranoid, violent man he would later become. By his 20s, Saddam had joined the Ba'ath Party, a nationalist movement that sought to unite the Arab world under a single banner of secular socialism. The Ba'ath ideology, developed by Michel Aflaq, promised modernization, Arab unity, and freedom from colonial interference. For young Saddam, however, it offered something far more personal: a path to power. In 1959, Saddam took part in a failed assassination attempt against Iraqi Prime Minister Abdul Karim Qasim. When the plot collapsed, he fled to Egypt, where he spent several years in exile. During this time, he studied law at Cairo University and immersed himself in Ba'athist ideology, even meeting its founder, Michel Aflaq, in person. These years shaped his political philosophy, blending Arab nationalism, socialist economics, and authoritarian control. When Saddam returned to Iraq after the Ba'ath Party seized power in 1963, he began his methodical climb up the political ladder. Using cunning, loyalty networks, and the ruthless elimination of rivals, he secured his place in the hierarchy. By 1968, when the Ba'ath Party regained control of Iraq, Saddam Hussein was already the real power behind the throne. Though officially serving as vice president under Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, everyone understood where true authority lay. Saddam consolidated his position through patronage, fear, and the systematic construction of a security apparatus that became legendary for its brutality. The Mukhabarat, Iraq's intelligence service, grew into a sprawling network of informants, interrogators, and executioners. Under Saddam's direction, it became one of the most feared organizations in the Middle East. The 1970s brought major transformations to Iraq under Ba'athist rule. Saddam orchestrated the nationalization of Iraq's oil industry, wresting control from foreign companies and channeling the revenues into ambitious development projects. Schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects rose across the country. Literacy rates improved dramatically, especially among women. Iraq's economy boomed, and for a brief moment, it seemed the nation might emerge as a regional powerhouse. Yet beneath this progress lay a darker reality. Every advancement came at the cost of freedom. Every economic gain was shadowed by political repression. Political dissent was not simply discouraged, it was obliterated. Saddam built his regime on a foundation of terror, understanding that fear was more reliable than affection. The Mukhabarat infiltrated every level of Iraqi society. Neighbors spied on neighbors. Children were encouraged to report on their parents' dinner table conversations. Even casual criticisms could result in disappearance. Those arrested by the secret police often vanished into a network of prisons and torture facilities, where screams went unheard and deaths went unrecorded. The regime's message was unmistakable. Loyalty was mandatory, and questioning was fatal. In July 1979, Saddam Hussein finally seized absolute power. In a calculated move, he forced the aging al-Bakr to resign and assumed the presidency himself. But Saddam was not satisfied with a simple transfer of power. He needed to demonstrate his dominance and eliminate any potential opposition. What followed was one of the most chilling displays of political theater in modern history, a purge that set the tone for his entire reign. On July 22, 1979, Saddam convened an extraordinary session of the Ba'ath Party leadership. Hundreds of officials gathered in a large auditorium, unaware of what awaited them. Standing at the podium with theatrical calm, smoking a cigar, Saddam announced the discovery of a Syrian-backed conspiracy within the party's ranks. He then summoned a tortured colleague, Muhammad Abdul Hussein, who mechanically read out a list of alleged conspirators' names. One by one, 68 officials were identified. As each name was called, armed guards escorted the accused from the hall. Some protested their innocence, others sat in stunned silence, while the rest erupted in applause, terrified that any hesitation might brand them as conspirators, too. Saddam watched it all, occasionally weeping crocodile tears, creating an atmosphere of surreal horror. The accused were taken away and executed. Some were even forced to participate in the firing squads that killed their colleagues, binding them to Saddam through complicity in murder. This massacre wiped out potential rivals and sent an unmistakable message. Opposition meant death, and everyone was expendable. The consolidation of power through terror was complete. But Saddam's ambitions stretched far beyond Iraq's borders. He envisioned himself as the leader who would unite the Arab world, the modern-day Saladin who would restore Arab glory. This grandiose vision would soon drag Iraq into one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. In September 1980, Saddam ordered the invasion of Iran, launching a war that would consume both nations for 8 devastating years. His motivations were many: to seize Iran's oil-rich Khuzestan province, to crush the Islamic revolutionary government that threatened to inspire Iraq's Shia majority, and to establish Iraq as the dominant power in the Persian Gulf. The Iran-Iraq War became a nightmare of modern warfare, combining the trench fighting of World War I with the weapons of the late 20th century. Human wave assaults, chemical attacks, and ballistic missiles aimed at civilian populations all became routine. Iraq received significant support from Western powers, particularly the United States, which saw Iran's revolutionary regime as the greater threat. American intelligence helped Iraqi forces target Iranian positions, while Western companies supplied the materials and technology that enabled Iraq to build its chemical weapons arsenal. The toll was staggering. Over 500,000 people dead, millions more wounded or displaced, and both nations' economies shattered. Throughout the conflict, Saddam showed his willingness to use any method, no matter how brutal, to achieve victory. When conventional warfare wasn't enough, he turned to chemical weapons. Mustard gas and nerve agents like tabun and sarin were unleashed on Iranian troops, transforming battlefields into scenes of unimaginable suffering. Soldiers choked on their own fluids, their skin blistered and burned, their nervous systems shutting down. The international community, prioritizing geopolitics over humanity, remained largely silent. This tacit acceptance of chemical warfare emboldened Saddam toward even greater atrocities. While war raged with Iran, Saddam's internal security apparatus carried on its own campaign of methodical brutality. The regime maintained dozens of detention facilities across Iraq, each specializing in unique forms of suffering. Abu Ghraib prison became the most infamous, though it was far from the only site of horror. Political prisoners, suspected dissidents, and anyone who drew the regime's suspicion risked being dragged into these facilities. Inside, interrogators employed techniques designed to break both body and spirit. Torture included electric shocks, suspension from ceilings for days, savage beatings, sexual assault, and psychological torment. Victims recalled being submerged in pools of sewage, having fingernails torn out, being burned with cigarettes and blowtorches, and being forced to watch their family members tortured in front of them. Women endured systematic sexual violence, used both as a tool of interrogation and as a weapon to destroy family honor. Even children were sometimes tortured before their parents' eyes to force confessions or extract information. This cruelty was not random, it was calculated. It was meant to crush all resistance and ensure a society too terrified to challenge the regime. The families of political opponents suffered especially horrific fates. Those who managed to escape Iraq and speak out from exile knew they had effectively signed death warrants for the relatives left behind. Saddam's forces would arrest entire families, using them as leverage against exiled dissidents. Brothers, sisters, parents, and children were imprisoned, tortured, and often executed. Sometimes, their bodies were returned to surviving relatives along with mocking, inflated bills for the bullets used in the executions. This grotesque practice served multiple purposes: punishing opposition, deterring defection, and demonstrating the regime's limitless reach. Religious leaders, too, were seen as threats. Saddam's secular Ba'athist ideology clashed with Islamic authority, and while he publicly claimed to respect Islam, any cleric who gained a following or voiced criticism quickly became a target. Grand Ayatollah Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr was one such figure. A respected Shia cleric, his Friday sermons drew thousands. Eventually, he began openly criticizing the regime's policies and calling for Islamic governance. In February 1999, gunmen assassinated him and two of his sons as they drove through Najaf. The regime denied involvement, but no one doubted who had ordered the killings. Many other religious leaders met similar fates when they refused to be reduced to tools of state propaganda. Perhaps the most horrific expression of Saddam's cruelty came in his treatment of Iraq's Kurdish population. The Kurds, an ethnic minority concentrated in the north, had long sought autonomy or independence. During the Iran-Iraq War, some Kurdish groups allied with Iran, hoping to advance their own goals. To Saddam, this was the ultimate betrayal, and he responded with a campaign of systematic extermination. Between 1986 and 1989, the Iraqi military carried out the Anfal campaign, a series of operations against Kurdish civilians that met the legal definition of genocide. The campaign was overseen by Saddam's cousin, Ahmed Hassan al-Majid, who earned the nickname Chemical Ali for his liberal use of chemical weapons against civilian populations. Iraqi forces destroyed thousands of Kurdish villages, forcibly relocated populations, and executed those who resisted. Men and teenage boys were separated from women and children, loaded onto trucks, and driven to remote sites where they were machine-gunned and dumped into mass graves. Some estimates suggest that as many as 182,000 Kurdish civilians were killed during the Anfal campaign, though the true number may never be known. Entire communities were wiped off the map, erased through industrial-scale murder. The attack on Alja stands as the single most horrific episode of the Anfal campaign. On March 16, 1988, Iraqi aircraft began dropping chemical weapons on this Kurdish town near the Iranian border. Over several hours, Iraqi forces released mustard gas, sarin, tabun, and VX nerve agents onto the civilian population below. Alja descended into hell. People died in the streets, in their homes, even in the shelters where they had sought safety. Parents perished while shielding their children. Children who died anyway. The poison spared no one, showing no mercy. Photographs from the aftermath reveal haunting images. Bodies frozen in their last moments. Mothers clutching babies, families huddled together, people collapsed mid-stride. Around 5,000 people died that day, with thousands more left suffering injuries that would scar them for life. Survivors described the chaos, the sickly sweet smell of chemicals in the air, the burning in their eyes and throats, the sheer panic as people realized they were being gassed. Many were left blind. Others suffered permanent lung damage. And in the years that followed, birth defects afflicted the next generation. Yet the world's response was muted. The United States even initially blamed Iran for the attack, despite overwhelming evidence of Iraqi responsibility. The geopolitical calculation was simple. Iraq was useful against Iran, and so its crimes could be ignored. This moral failure would echo for decades to come. Saddam's sons, Uday and Qusay, deserve special mention in any account of the regime's brutality. Both were raised in an environment saturated with violence and absolute power, but they carried their father's legacy in very different ways. Qusay was cold and methodical, eventually placed in charge of the Special Republican Guard and the Mukhabarat. He enforced his father's policies with bureaucratic precision, overseeing torture centers and directing security operations. Uday, the elder son, was something else entirely. A sadistic psychopath whose cruelty shocked even those hardened by the regime's violence. His reign of terror was personal, unpredictable, and vicious. Uday haunted parties and nightclubs, selecting women who caught his eye. Refusal was not an option. Those who resisted were raped, tortured, and sometimes murdered. He once beat a servant to death for losing his father's mail. At a party in 1988, he murdered his father's personal valet, bludgeoning him to death with a cane in front of horrified guests, because he blamed the man for introducing Saddam to a new wife. Even Saddam realized that Uday was spiraling out of control and briefly exiled him to Switzerland. But Uday returned, and his sadism continued unchecked. In 1984, Uday was placed in charge of Iraqi sports, becoming head of the Iraqi Olympic Committee. Athletes who failed to meet his expectations faced brutal punishments. Soccer players who lost important matches were beaten on the soles of their feet, imprisoned, or even forced to kick concrete balls. Uday also ran his own private torture facility, where he personally took part in interrogations and punishments. His cruelty knew no limits. He forced parents to watch as their children were tortured, or compelled individuals to harm their own family members. Tales of Uday's depravity spread across Iraq, adding yet another layer of fear to an already terrorized nation. The regime's brutality was not limited to people. It extended to Iraq's environment and cultural heritage as well. One of its most devastating campaigns targeted the Marsh Arabs, or Madan, who had lived in the wetlands of southern Iraq for thousands of years. Their culture and way of life were uniquely tied to the marshlands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. After the 1991 Gulf War, when Shia rebels launched an uprising against Saddam, many of them sought refuge in the marshes. Saddam's response was as brutal as ever. He ordered the marshes drained, destroying not only the land but also the people who depended on it. This was ethnic cleansing combined with environmental destruction on a staggering scale. Iraqi engineers diverted rivers, constructed dams, and dug canals to dry out the wetlands. What had once been 20,000 square kilometers of thriving marshland shrank to less than 1,500 within a decade. The ecological devastation was catastrophic. Countless species of birds, fish, and other wildlife lost their habitats. But the human cost was even more devastating. The Madan people lost their homes, their culture, and in many cases, their lives. Villages were burned, populations forcibly relocated to government-controlled zones, and those who resisted were killed. Chemical weapons were used in some areas, while death squads hunted down fleeing refugees. It is estimated that as many as 200,000 Marsh Arabs were killed or displaced. Their ancient culture was nearly obliterated. The 1990 invasion of Kuwait revealed that Saddam's ambitions had not been tempered by the devastation of the Iran-Iraq War. Iraq emerged from that conflict economically ruined and deeply in debt, particularly to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Saddam demanded that these debts be forgiven and that Kuwait reduce its oil production so that prices would rise. When Kuwait refused, Saddam turned to force. On August 2, 1990, Iraqi troops stormed into Kuwait, overwhelming the small nation's defenses within hours. What followed was an occupation marked by systematic brutality, torture, and mass theft. Iraqi forces treated Kuwait as plunder, stripping it of everything valuable: cars, hospital equipment, and, during Iraq's occupation of Kuwait, nothing was spared. Industrial machinery was stripped away, even traffic lights were dismantled. Museums were looted, private homes were ransacked, and Kuwaiti citizens who dared to resist were met with imprisonment, torture, or execution. Thousands were arrested and disappeared by Iraqi intelligence services. Torture centers operated openly, subjecting victims to the same horrors perfected in Iraq's domestic prisons. Women were raped systematically, used as weapons of terror. When Iraqi forces finally retreated in February 1991, forced out by a U.S.-led coalition, they torched Kuwait's oil fields, creating an environmental catastrophe that blanketed the skies in smoke for months. But the end of the Gulf War did not bring peace. Instead, Iraq itself was plunged into new suffering. The coalition's swift and crushing victory devastated Iraq's military infrastructure. Encouraged by President George H.W. Bush's calls for Iraqis to rise up against Saddam, Shia communities in the south and Kurdish groups in the north launched rebellions. Yet the American support they expected never came. Saddam's remaining forces, particularly the Republican Guard, moved in with brutal efficiency. The uprisings were crushed. Thousands were executed, often in public squares as grim warnings. Helicopter gunships rained fire on civilian neighborhoods, while artillery leveled rebel-held cities. The international community imposed harsh economic sanctions on Iraq, meant to force Saddam into complying with UN resolutions. But sanctions are blunt instruments. They rarely cripple the powerful. Instead, they devastate the powerless. In Iraq, it was ordinary citizens who paid the price. Malnutrition soared, child mortality skyrocketed, and the once excellent healthcare system collapsed. Medicines became scarce, water treatment facilities broke down, and diseases long under control returned with deadly force. Some estimates suggest 500,000 children died as a direct result of deprivation caused by sanctions. Saddam, meanwhile, manipulated the suffering for propaganda, blaming the West while hoarding resources and allowing his people to starve. Even as Iraq's children died from easily preventable illnesses, Saddam and his inner circle lived in obscene luxury. He built dozens of lavish palaces across the country, each more extravagant than the last. Billions were poured into luxury goods, weapons, and personal indulgence. His sons lived like untouchable warlords, taking whatever they wanted with total impunity. Corruption was not hidden, it was shameless, systemic, and designed to enrich Saddam's family and his tribal allies from Tikrit, who controlled Iraq's most important industries while the rest of the country crumbled. As the years wore on, Saddam's paranoia deepened. He saw conspiracies everywhere and responded with purges that devoured even his most loyal followers. In 1995, his own sons-in-law, Hussein Camel and Saddam Camel, defected to Jordan, revealing intelligence about Iraq's weapons programs. Saddam lured them back with promises of forgiveness, then had them killed along with their father and other relatives. The message was unmistakable. No one was safe. No bond was sacred. Loyalty meant nothing if Saddam suspected betrayal. The culture of fear reached its peak. Public executions became routine spectacles of terror. Bodies of prisoners were hung from lampposts or left to rot in public squares. Families of the executed were forbidden to mourn, as grief itself could be seen as dissent. Torture and executions were even recorded on video, used as intimidation tools, shown to prisoners to break their spirit, and circulated among security forces to normalize brutality and instill loyalty through fear. The regime also built an elaborate surveillance and control system. Every Iraqi carried an identity booklet that listed their sect, tribe, and political reliability. Moving to a new town required state permission. Career advancement hinged on Barith party membership, which itself demanded displays of loyalty, often proven by direct participation in regime violence. Children of party members were rewarded with better schools and jobs, creating a privileged class invested in Saddam's survival. This system left little room for innocence. In Iraq, people were either perpetrators, victims, or silent witnesses. Religious and ethnic minorities bore particular hardships. Christians, Yazidis, Mandaeans, and others lived precariously, tolerated as long as they remained politically invisible, yet always at risk of persecution. Iraq's Jewish community, once numbering more than 150,000, dwindled to fewer than 100 by the end of Saddam's rule, the rest having fled or been expelled. Those who remained lived under constant fear. Minorities were often scapegoated, blamed for the nation's crises to deflect anger from the regime itself. Women also suffered as Saddam shifted toward appealing to conservative religious sentiment. In the early Ba'athist years, women's rights had advanced, but under Saddam's later rule, they became casualties of his political survival. Honor killings were effectively legalized. Men who murdered female relatives for alleged sexual misconduct faced minimal punishment. Economic desperation drove many women into prostitution, which the regime itself exploited. Saddam's government operated brothels for officials and foreign allies, and women were forced into sexual slavery. The destruction Saddam inflicted was not limited to human lives. It tore apart Iraq's culture, society, and very sense of stability. Iraq's extraordinary archaeological heritage also suffered under Saddam. While he built monuments to himself and claimed descent from ancient Mesopotamian kings, his regime allowed priceless archaeological sites to be looted and damaged. His much-publicized reconstruction of Babylon involved building modern structures directly on top of ancient remains, destroying irreplaceable evidence in the process. He even stamped his own name on the bricks used in the reconstruction, a grotesque parody of the ancient kings he sought to emulate. Artifacts were sold off to fund regime activities, and ordinary Iraqis, desperate for survival, plundered sites with the regime's complicity. Thousands of years of human history were stripped and ransacked during his rule. The final chapter of Saddam's reign began in March 2003, when U.S.-led coalition forces invaded Iraq. The military campaign was swift, and Baghdad fell by April. Saddam, however, managed to evade capture for months, until December 2003, when he was discovered near his hometown of Tikrit, hiding in a cramped underground hole. The capture was anticlimactic. The once feared dictator who had terrorized millions was found disheveled, disoriented, and pathetic. Yet even in captivity, Saddam tried to project dignity, refusing to admit to any wrongdoing. He was put on trial before an Iraqi court for crimes against humanity, specifically for his role in the Dujail massacre, where 148 Shia men and boys were executed in retaliation for an assassination attempt on him. The trial was contentious. Saddam remained defiant, repeatedly disrupting proceedings, using the courtroom as his stage. He ranted about American imperialism and cast himself as a patriotic leader betrayed by foreign powers. While the trial did reveal details of the regime's atrocities, it was also criticized for procedural irregularities. On November 5, 2006, Saddam was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. Appeals were rejected, and the sentence was carried out on December 30, 2006. His execution quickly became controversial. Unauthorized mobile phone footage of the hanging was leaked and spread worldwide. The video showed Saddam being mocked and taunted by onlookers chanting sectarian slogans as he stood on the gallows. Yet he maintained composure, refused to show fear, and died reciting the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith. The leaked footage drew international criticism, with many arguing the execution had been carried out unprofessionally, stripping even a condemned prisoner of the dignity supposed to accompany death. In many ways, the chaotic nature of his end mirrored the violence and disorder that had defined his life and rule. Saddam Hussein's legacy is one of mass graves, devastated landscapes, shattered communities, and traumatized generations. Forensic teams have identified dozens of mass graves across Iraq containing the remains of hundreds of thousands of victims. The full number of deaths caused by his regime remains unknown but certainly exceeds 500,000, with some estimates reaching into the millions once casualties of the Iran-Iraq War are included. His rule left Iraq divided along sectarian and ethnic lines, its economy ruined, its infrastructure destroyed, and its people deeply scarred. The 2003 invasion that toppled him did not heal these wounds but instead unleashed new waves of chaos and violence that would claim hundreds of thousands more lives in the years that followed. Saddam's brutality remains a stark reminder of what happens when absolute power rests in the hands of a man without conscience or accountability. His rise had been wrapped in noble rhetoric, Arab unity, anti-imperialism, social progress, but in his hands, these ideals were twisted and corrupted. He transformed the state into a machine of terror, fractured society through fear, and normalized brutality until it became routine. The men who ran his torture centers and firing squads, who drained the marshes and dropped gas on villages, remind us that atrocities do not require only monstrous leaders, they require entire systems of complicity. Saddam's story is not just history. It resonates because it shows timeless truths about power, fear, and human nature. It shows how dictators cling to control through calculated violence, how they exploit sectarian divides, and how they weaponize ideology while pursuing only self-interest. It also demonstrates the catastrophic failure of international systems meant to prevent such atrocities. The United Nations proved unable or unwilling to stop chemical attacks on civilians. Western powers supported Saddam for geopolitical reasons, ignoring his crimes. The lofty rhetoric of human rights was exposed as hollow when weighed against political convenience. For the Iraqi people, the trauma of Saddam's reign is still present. Survivors of his torture chambers live with lifelong physical and psychological scars. Families continue to search for loved ones who disappeared decades ago, with little hope of closure. Children raised under sanctions and war grew up knowing nothing but fear and instability. The sectarian violence that erupted after 2003 has deep roots in the injustices of Saddam's rule, when a Sunni minority dominated and a Shia majority was brutally repressed. The existence of today's Kurdish autonomous region is itself partly a response to the genocidal campaigns waged against the Kurds. In every way, Iraq's present still carries the imprint of his decades in power. Saddam imagined himself destined for greatness, a modern-day savior who would restore Arab pride and power. Instead, he became synonymous with tyranny. His name evokes brutality and megalomania. The palaces he built stand as empty monuments to vanity. The statues once erected to honor him have been torn down. The cult of personality he carefully crafted has been exposed as hollow propaganda. What remains is only the trail of suffering he left behind. The murdered, the tortured, the displaced, the poisoned. His rule transformed Iraq from a nation of promise and prosperity into a cautionary tale about unchecked power. The question that lingers is how one man, backed by a small circle of loyalists, managed to terrorize an entire nation for so long, and why the international community allowed it to happen. The lessons of Saddam Hussein's reign remain urgent. They remind us that evil can be ordinary, that atrocities are carried out not only by sadistic leaders but by bureaucrats and functionaries obeying orders. They show how fear can enslave entire societies, and how international silence in the face of crimes becomes its own form of complicity. They show how absolute power corrupts not only the powerless, but also those who wield it, turning people into monsters and societies into prisons. They remind us how quickly nationalist dreams can descend into genocidal tyranny, how noble intentions can be corrupted, and how, without accountability, human cruelty has no limits. As the years pass and survivors age, the danger of forgetting grows. Already, some attempt to rehabilitate Saddam's image, pointing to the stability of Iraq's early Ba'athist period while downplaying the terror. But such revisionism dishonors the dead and insults the survivors. The mass graves demand remembrance. The testimony of survivors demands that their suffering be heard. The children who grew up in fear deserve their truth told. History's judgment on Saddam Hussein is clear. He was a tyrant whose brutality scarred a nation and whose crimes against humanity place him among the most brutal mass murderers of the 20th century. That judgment cannot be softened by time or political convenience. The full accounting of Saddam's crimes may never be possible. Many mass graves remain hidden, documents destroyed, witnesses dead, secrets taken to the grave. Yet what we do know, the chemical attacks, the industrial-scale torture, the ethnic cleansing, the casual cruelty, the systematic campaign of terror, is more than enough for history's verdict. Saddam Hussein built his rule on bones and sustained it with blood. His ambition delivered not greatness but catastrophe, not unity but division, not strength but ruin. The horrors of his reign were not accidents of war, but the purest expression of his character and his philosophy of power. Saddam understood that terror was the foundation of his rule, and he never hesitated to wield it with ruthless efficiency. That is his legacy, and that is how history will remember him.